which you'll be getting weekly from here on out. The purpose is to set you up with a broad understanding of whatever genre or decade or a movement we're discussing that week, in order to understand some of the larger trends and changes that are happening. And so this week we'll be talking about the early 1900s, predecessors of rock and roll, such as rhythm and blues, country, country boogie, and gospel. So with that being said, let's begin. I like starting with this quote from Little Richard. "The blues had an illegitimate baby, and we named it rock and roll." Now, as cheeky and as full of classic Little Richard sass as this quote is, the idea is very much correct. This is identifying blues specifically, but it really could apply to a number of different genres that influence the formation of rock and roll. And so when we talk about the predecessors, or the roots of rock and roll, we really can't hone in and single out a single tradition or a single genre that then transformed and became rock and roll. Rather, there were all sorts of streams and tributaries and rainfall that was just streaming together to create this big waterfall that would then become rock and roll music. And so even the three that I've identified this week is by no means an exhaustive list. But I have tried to identify three meaningful streams that I think should give a pretty well-rounded picture of the influences for rock and roll. And so the three streams I've chosen to focus on today are country boogie and a number of attendant similar country-related genres. Here I have it illustrated by Hank Williams. Rhythm and blues, as exemplified here by Willie Mae, Big Mama Thornton. And then gospel, as illustrated by Sister Rosetta Tharpe, although I easily could have chosen Thomas Dorsey or Mahalia Jackson or many others. As we consider these predecessors, I want to really bring out two overarching themes. One is the pervasive influence of Black American musical styles in the various genres that then influence rock and roll. So while it may not be true that rock and roll strictly came only from Black musical genres, as we see here with country boogie, which is mostly a white American genre, in fact, Black musical influences were pervasive even in those other genres that were more representative of white communities. So the influence of Black American musical styles in the formation of rock and roll is inescapable. Second, I want to highlight the prominence of female artists in these predecessors of rock and roll. Oftentimes when we start to tell the story of rock and roll starting from the 1950s through the 60s and on, the presence of female musicians often starts to be diminished or even erased entirely. But female artists are very much present and visible right here in the predecessors, such as Big Mama Thornton and Rosetta Tharpe. Let's start by talking about country boogie, and in fact, a number of different genres that are just sort of aligned with the country tradition in general. So this tends to refer to white, rural, Southern American musical styles. What you start to see is there was a fusion of Black American musical influences in the South with British folk music traditions and other folk music traditions such as growing up in the Appalachians or in the New Orleans Delta or many other places in the South. So starting to combine these influences, what you got is a musical style that's centered on guitar family instruments, such as the steel string guitar and the banjo, combined with fiddle or piano. Now, in the 1930s, these country forms started to be really popularized over the radio, especially the WSM Nashville radio, which had a show called Grand Ole Opry. In this show, a number of different musical acts or variety show acts were featured, such as country bands like the Fruit Jar Drinkers, Uncle Dave Macon, and Roy Acuff. Now, post-World War II, the pace of life began to quicken. More and more population was shifting to urban centers, and you had the rise of the electric guitar as a prominent instrument. And fusing this with the earlier country influences was what gave rise to country boogie. This style of country boogie was played in raucous clubs and bars in the South, and thus required a loud sound to be heard, a sound that the electric guitar was perfect for. Now, I mentioned Hank Williams earlier, who probably experienced the highest popularity of hillbilly music from 1946 to 1952. Hillbilly is another one of those genres that's sort of under this rough, loose country umbrella, and that eventually combines with rock to make rockabilly. Hank Williams' song "I'll Never Get Out of This World Alive," which you can hear on the Spotify playlist for this week, became a #1 chart topper. Unfortunately, Hank Williams died in his 20s, but his influence remained on many of the early rock and roll musicians such as Bill Haley. Then there was also Arthur Smith, who was a country guitarist and released the record known as Guitar Boogie. And this then was really a classic country boogie record that influenced many boogie-woogie guitarists such as Jack Guthrie. So the country-inspired electric guitar playing, such as by Arthur Smith, as well as by others such as Rosetta Tharpe that we'll talk about later, really became prominent and influential, referenced by many early rock and roll artists. In general, as you'll hear in the Spotify playlist, country boogie was known for an energetic, jumping guitar style and rhythmic energy. Now, one effect that country boogie had was subtly introducing Southerners to the sounds of Black American musical styles and influences. What this meant is it started to generate a craving or a taste for Black American music, even in a time when segregation was keeping white and Black communities separate.